basically, why are we here today? And the context for putting this together, this session on innovative finance for employment, is because here on the social finance side, we've been working with MUVA, which is a non-profit in Mozambique, over several months, thinking about how they can improve employment for the particular disadvantaged populations that they work with. And they're interested in how innovative finance can help them to scale up their impact. And we'll talk a bit more in a minute about the specifics of that work. But we realized as we were working with them and from our other connections and relationships to social finance that this theme of supporting vulnerable populations into work is quite a salient one at this time. Obviously, at this point of the global pandemic, it's clearly an issue around an economic crisis and an employment crisis, and particularly for vulnerable populations who are out of work. But also, this is very much a global challenge. We're working and partnering with MUVA in Mozambique, but this current challenge is one that all countries are facing, lower and higher income. So we're deliberately trying to bring together groups that don't normally talk to each other. So from Mozambique to South Africa and to the UK. So we'll be using different language, different groups, but hopefully there'll be some themes coming out. We thought it was the right time to convene a global conversation on this theme of innovative finance for employment, particularly around supporting vulnerable populations into work. And that's why we have the 4 organizations with us today. We will kind of meet everybody in a minute. My name is Rob Mills. I'm one of the directors of the international team at Social Finance. But just while waiting for lots of people to join, then very quickly, our plan for now is for the next 90 minutes or so, some introductions. I will make a short presentation on essentially unpacking innovative finance and how it can support vulnerable populations in Mozambique. And then we'll move on to a panel discussion, which is really the interesting part for me, really the why and the how of innovative finance in a very kind of practical sense. We'll then have plenty of time for Q&A and some final thoughts. Just while we're waiting for the last people to join, some housekeeping. No need for me to read through those, but it's obviously we've spent a lot of time on Zoom, all of us, the last 18 months, and these are things we've found to be quite useful for this kind of webinar. So I'll leave those with you. And my colleague Lizanne Kawa from Social Finance will be kind of tag teaming with me to try and keep things moving along. And she's been heavily involved in the partnership with MUVA as well. Okay, so for me, the most exciting part is not listening to me talk, it's listening to our panelists, which we'll get to in about 15 minutes. So I'll let them introduce themselves. I'm going to ask them to just briefly summarize what their organizations do, but also to give us 2 or 3 kind of killer facts, as it were, about the very specific employment challenges they're facing in their countries, just to bring this all to life a bit before we start. So Iana, should we just start with you?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Rob. It's really good to be here. I'm very happy to be with you as panelists and with all the audience as well. Thank you for coming. So MUVA is a social incubator, which goal is to unlock barriers that vulnerable women and youth face to access the labour market. And we do that from a global South perspective by creating and testing innovative interventions in the areas of labour insertion, entrepreneurship, and education. And our headquarters is in Mozambique, and I am the head of the Entrepreneurship department in MUVA. From where we stand, the need for women's economic empowerment is very clear in a country where there is a population of 30 million people, and only approximately 700,000 jobs available in the entire country, resulting in a large informal economy, as you mentioned. Of these jobs available, women access only 6%, although there are almost 80% of male adults participating in the labor force. So, and the situation is even worse in other settings where we in MUVA mostly work, where women between 19 and 24 years old have the highest unemployment rate in the country. And most of them work, of course, in the informal economy. So in this quite challenging scenario, as Rob said, MUVA teamed up with social finance to explore innovative financing mechanisms to pave the way to increase the amount of resources available in the country for youth employment and women's economic empowerment. And I believe Rob will speak in more detail about this.
Brilliant, thank you, Iana. Chipo, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and Harambee?
Awesome. So I am with the Impact and Storytelling team at Harambee Youth Employment Accelerator. And we are a non-profit social enterprise designed to kind of help optimize young people's pathways to employment in the country. South Africa has one of the highest youth unemployment rates globally and quite a high unemployment rate across the economy. And we have spent the last 10 years trying to figure out how to make those pathways clearer. And right now we have a network that helps and serves over 1.4 million young people. And we've helped to place around 500,000 young people in work opportunities over that period. And I guess like facts that kind of bring it home for the South African context are that in the next 5 years, of the 6 million young people who will be entering the workforce, only 2 million young people will immediately enter education or the workforce, which means that about 4 million of those, like over 70% of those, have no clear sight into how it is that they'll be able to navigate and get jobs. And within that context, we found that South Africa is slightly different from most other middle income countries and most other African economies, in that like our informal economy isn't as well developed, and our formal economy has consistently been the growth engine of the country. But with the current changes, it looks like over the next 5 years, the formal economy will only be able to absorb about 20% of all labor capacity entering the market. And so that's kind of where we found ourselves right now in trying to address the issues of youth employment.
Thank you, Chippo. And then Graham and Rebecca from WDP in the UK. Thanks.
Hi, thanks, Rob. So my name's Graham Howard. I'm part of the leadership team at WDP, which is primarily a drug and alcohol support charity here in the UK. I work very closely with Rebecca on our employability programs. So the journey that's brought us here is we've been primarily a specialist in helping people tackle the problem itself of drug and alcohol addiction and become abstinent. But that involves a lot of other real world outcomes that people need to achieve in order to actually stay abstinent. So that's stable accommodation, stable employment, family situation, for example. Over the past 20 years or so in the UK, the employability market has been excessively formalised by the government, and there have been a number of employability schemes run under different financial models. But as things have developed, the outcomes haven't necessarily always improved for those most marginalised. So now you see a lot more programmes here in the UK which are specifically targeting groups that are very marginalised from employment, and they're now more and more being delivered by specialists with the group rather than overemployability specialists. So that's where we come in. We'll talk more about the project later, but both Rebecca and I were involved in setting that up, and Rebecca oversees it operationally. In terms of what the picture is here in the UK, as you might imagine, we have quite a well-developed labour market that is extremely formalised, which is both a blessing and a curse in terms of these programmes, because it is in some ways easier to collect the data. But in a formalised employment economy, it is also much easier for the disadvantaged to be marginalised from employment due to declarations, etc. In terms of the problem that we face with this group, the cost of drug use and supply to society in the UK is estimated to cost us around £10.7 billion per year, of which 6 billion is related to crime. And alcohol harm costs us about 21 billion a year, with the cost to our health service of 3.5 billion. So a very large bill there. And the groups that we work with, particularly people who are using opiates, such as heroin, the employment outcomes for them are really, really bad. So if people come into treatment with organisation like WDP or our sister organisations, they'll probably be in treatment for anything up to 5 years or possibly more. And you're going to see 68% of that cohort consistently unemployed throughout their entire time with us, whether they enter into recovery or not. And of the other 32%, only 16% are continually employed. And of the rest of that, another 8% on each side, either increased employment or decreased employment. So there's some real entrenched issues with that group for employability. And every year we've got around 300,000 working age adults in treatment in the UK. But despite the health progress that is made with them, the majority still fail to find work, which is why we need schemes such as the one we're talking about today.
Brilliant, thanks, Graham. I think this is a useful starting point for all of us, in that what it's bringing home for me is how acute these problems are, despite the differences in the contexts. Obviously there's regulatory differences and budget differences, but nonetheless, we've got some very acute problems that we're trying to tackle. And the idea of this session now is to think about how we may frame them differently and look at them differently from the perspective of the funding. So what I'm going to do is spend the next 10 to 15 minutes giving a bit of a kind of framing presentation about innovative finance, and then a bit of detail about the work we did with MUVA in Mozambique. And then I think the interesting part is with the panelists thinking about how that resonates for them and the particular ways they've used or are thinking about using innovative finance. So let me start a little bit high level and talking about the kind of overall landscape of innovative finance, which frankly is a confusing one. I'm not even going to try and define it. Instead, I kind of made the mistake of Googling innovative finance, and what you come up with is just a long list of kind of esoteric names of things that people do categorized as innovative finance. And this is not even a comprehensive list. So what I'm going to do is give you my take on this landscape, which is that it really boils down to a couple of things. One is around instruments that mobilize additional resources. So put that lot on the left-hand side. And the second thing, which is of much more interest to us here, I think, is around instruments that really improve the cost effectiveness of public spending. And I'm going to focus just on the right-hand side for today. There is actually at least one blended finance in the middle, and we'll touch on that a little bit later as well. The reason I'm focusing on the right-hand side is that social finance, our interest is in how these kinds of ways of working can use public spending more effectively to achieve better outcomes. And by public spending, that could be, in the context of this webinar, could be both national or local government budget, but also donor budgets in the international development space. So that's why we're interested in that right-hand side. But in a way, this is not a good place to start at all, because that's just a kind of a list of fancy sounding instruments. And for me, the crucial thing is with innovative finance is not about picking a new instrument and hoping it works, and particularly not picking one because it's kind of fashionable or trendy. For me, innovative finance is really about the kind of secret sauce of what's going on inside these funding instruments. And it's really about how it changes different actors' behavior in a funding relationship to produce better results. Let me say that again. So the secret sauce of innovative finance for me is how it changes the behavior of different actors in a funding relationship, and those could include the funders themselves, to produce better results from whatever program or initiative is being funded. So in that secret sauce, for me, there are 6 ingredients, and these are ones which we'll come back to again, both in the context of Mozambique, but also when we have the panel session. The first of those kind of ingredients of the secret sauce is really around accountability for results. If you want greater clarity on who should be accountable for the impact of your spending, whether you're a donor or you're a government, then having instruments that really make accountability clear is really important. A second ingredient of the secret sauce of innovative finance is around incentives that are both sharp and shared. So a well-designed funding package can make it really clear and really sort of strong incentives to achieve results, but also align all the partners involved around a common goal. A third bit of the secret sauce is around creating space in a program for innovation and iteration. A package of funding which requires the service provider on the ground to do sort of a set number of things in a set sequence is not going to be a good way to tackle precisely the kind of tough social challenges that Iana and Chippo and Graham just outlined in their different contexts. I mean, at the front line of these organizations, there needs to be space to learn to what's happening, to respond to things on the ground, and to form new partnerships and to try again, to try something new. And so funding that allows that is also vital. Following on from that, if you want to be able to learn and adapt your program, then you have to understand what's going on. You have to have some level of measurability, and you have to have reliable data. So data and measurement for adaptive implementation of a program is also a key enabler. Two more. This one's slightly odd, but the idea of risk appetite will be familiar to some of you. And the idea that risk needs to be allocated to the parties that are best placed to hold it. And that could be financial risk, sure. It could also be operational risk. And I mean, we find in our work that some people are more risk averse and some people have more risk appetite than others. So for example, donors, in my experience, tend to be quite risk averse, but investors, almost by definition, are seeking some level of risk. So in a program, using the funding to work out who should hold the risk. And the last part of this is really around novel partnerships. So aligning partners to work together who haven't necessarily worked together previously. So taken, I mean, there are probably other ways you could cut this, but taken together, that for me is the kind of 6 parts of the secret sauce of innovative finance. And I'm much less focused on the technicalities of the instrument. And I'm much more focused on whether the funding and how it's put together and how it's designed can help at the program level deliver some of these things. Okay, still a little bit abstract. How is this actually relevant to the employment challenge in Mozambique that Iana started with? So just a few words on the work. We have produced a report which we'll put a little advert out for later. But we started by thinking really carefully about what the employment challenges were for the disadvantaged groups that MUVA focuses on. And those are in urban areas, women and youth particularly. And we came up with a whole list of employment challenges. And I'm not going to go through them now, but I just picked out 1 or 2, which I think are interesting for this discussion. So for example, in Mozambique, the importance of a culture change among employers so that they actively accommodate disadvantaged populations is a real challenge. Other things we really kind of pulled out, entrepreneurship in the Mozambique context really suffers from weak market dynamics. And by that I mean, if you're an early stage enterprise, let's say a woman-led informal enterprise, getting the right mix of funding as you grow on the right financial terms is really difficult. There's a real challenge there. And so as we went through this work, we identified a whole set of challenges for these disadvantaged groups when it comes to employment and employability. And we also then looked at the kind of funding structures that are already in place. And we observed that there are some structural problems with the way funding is already happening. Again, we came up with a long list. And again, I'm not going to go through it now, but just pulling out 1 or 2 which seem relevant. Very few of the initiatives in Mozambique funded, particularly by donors, have attempted to improve labor supply, which is a horribly ugly word. By that I mean the kind of the people, and trying to stimulate labor demand, which is an ugly word for employers employing people. They haven't tried to do that at the same time, and so you have a kind of often a mismatch. Again, there's more things we came up with, but here's another one. The funders are very reluctant to engage with the informal sector. And so there's been a limited funding for conversion of transferable skills, which would help that engagement with the informal sector and some of those transitions to formality. And again, that's something which Iana mentioned. So a whole list of structural shortcomings of the current funding patterns. So then we tried to say, well, if there is a set of challenges for employment and a set of shortcomings in how funding is currently working, then, well, what might we do differently? And when it starts to come into thinking about funding design, how you put different types of funders together, we thought about sort of three key choices in funding design. The first one is kind of who. So, on one side, is this targeting the supply of people, or is it targeting demand for these disadvantaged populations from the employers, or some combination of both? There's a question around where. So are we talking about purely the informal sector or purely the formal sector, or something dynamic in between? And lastly, whose money are we talking about? Are we talking about the public sector, including donors or foundations? Or are we also talking about the role of private money as well, essentially investment money? And what we started to do was think about how we could incorporate the secret sauce of innovative finance in the design of a funding program to tackle those challenges that we'd identified at the outset. I am not going to try and go through all of these because I will be here for a while. But what we did was come up with 4 models. The first was around female economic empowerment, and particularly looking at the possibility of an impact bond to improve both the employment but also the employability of women who were excluded from the job markets. And that was very much a kind of looking at the sort of at the labour side of the market, of the problem. A second model was looking much more at public works programs, public sector employment programs, and trying to be much clearer around what the outcomes were of those. So moving beyond a traditional works program to something much more outcomes focused, such as urban renewal or environmental renewal, and really trying to focus on the sort of measurement and measurability of those programs. A third model was really around blended finance, and here it was trying to form some novel partnerships, particularly between programs such as the ones that MUVA runs and larger companies, and providing some strong incentives through a financing package for those employers to improve the prospects of what we've called disadvantaged urban youth and women groups. So new partnerships between organizations that hadn't really worked together with some strong financial incentives behind them. And then the fourth model we came up with was much more at the early stage of enterprises, and trying to have a much more kind of tailored way of taking early stage fragile enterprises from kind of grants and technical assistance through at the right point for some of them into investment. And in this case, thinking about how the risk and trying to shift it away from the financially fragile enterprises themselves to those who might want to take on the risk, such as social or impact investors. So in all those models, some of the secret sauce is coming through. It's not all of it in all of them, but hopefully you can see the kind of link to what I said before in these models. Now, these are a little bit complex on the page. The model, the report we wrote goes into a bit more detail, but that just gives you a bit of a sense of what we were trying to achieve. We finished by essentially creating a map of how those models sit. And they're sitting between, on one hand, if you take these kind of colored bars, the kind of demand, essentially the demand and supply side. The demand for employees is the green bar at the top, supply of employees is the purple line at the bottom, and then orange is sort of programs that have both. And on the top, the program focus, is this around informality and lower skilled jobs, or is it more kind of formal sector and technically demanding jobs, technically skilled jobs? And we essentially worked out that where to place these different models on essentially a bit of a map. So the first model is very much a kind of supply side model. The second model around cash transfers for outcomes-based public works and public programs that produce public goods as a mix of demand and supply of employees, had some demand side elements to it. The third model was much more around trying to stimulate the demand for for employees from these disadvantaged groups through use of financial incentives. And the fourth model was essentially in the middle, being a mix of both supply and demand side. So we're trying to think about these kind of key program levers of informal versus formal, supply versus demand, public versus private, and kind of get a wide range of models which would tackle the wide range of problems that MUVA knows so well in Mozambique. Okay, short advert. That is the report, which is on our website as of today. Lizanne, if you are still there and people can still hear me, then perhaps you could share that in the chat. And that is what I wanted to say as a quick overview of the work we were doing with MUVA, which inspired this webinar. Good. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we're now going to go directly into the panel part. And I think we're doing okay for time. What I suggest is that we don't have Q&A on what I just said right now, because this was really just a framing of some of the kind of theory of innovative finance, and then some of the analysis and proposals and models we put together for MUVA in the Mozambique context. What we're going to do now is really move into the panel session, where we're going to try and bring this to life a bit more. So let me stop sharing my screen. Hopefully I'm still here with everybody. Good. I am going to just bear with me while I get my notes on the next part. So we're going to start with thinking about the sort of, not the theory of this, but sort of the how these kind of ideas of innovative finance, and particularly this secret sauce, if that's a nice metaphor to use, how when it came to thinking about innovative finance and the role in your programs, how that sort of theory started to come off the page. What did you think about when you were identifying the problem? And I know particularly for WDP and Harambee that you've actually used innovative finance in your program. So what was the thinking about doing that? What did you think it would sort of help you do? And then for Iana, the question is, well, why are you exploring it now, and why do you think it might help? So let's maybe just start with Iana. So yeah, that question of why did you think this whole innovative finance thing was going to be useful for the particular challenges that you've identified?
Yeah, well, thanks, Rob. For us, the main element about innovative approaches to funding is the opportunity to improve incentives for the relevant funders and service providers to consider Mozambique as a viable place to invest in. And we say this because in addition to being the 7th poorest country in the world, Mozambique also suffers from being the only Portuguese-speaking country in Southern and East Africa, and from having the Portuguese legislation framework, which is quite different from the English and the French ones. And this is important because it's an additional layer of complexity for funders and service providers when choosing to operate in a challenging economy, such as Mozambican one. And this has been isolating Mozambique for other kinds of funding, such as impact investing and even international foundations. And we began to be interested in exploring innovative financing mechanisms because this was starting to change in the past years, especially last year when we began this work with social finance. And there are many factors for this, but I think there are these two that I will be speaking about was being highlighted. The first one is that one of the biggest gas projects of the world was being set up in the north of the country. And with it, the potential of private sector resources and interest in Mozambique was absolutely growing. So there was an opportunity to leverage private sector resources beyond usual corporate social responsibility projects. And the second main factor is basically political. So the Mozambican youth secretary has received a mandate to work with the issue of the demographic transition, investing more in the agenda of the youth economic inclusion through employment and entrepreneurship. And this is becoming to be a political priority for the country. And what we have been seeing in addition to this changing agenda is that there is an openness to contract service providers and private sector players to perform some of the work in partnership with the government. And this is very new, both a thematic area of youth economic inclusion and the openness for public-private partnerships. Mozambique has very few examples of public-private partnerships since its independence. So this is, I mean, because of the need of having alignment between all of those actors and incentives and interests, we thought there was an opportunity, and there is an opportunity for Mozambique to be pushing forward this agenda. Unfortunately, now the gas project was forcibly stopped due to quite violent and terrible events in the north, and we don't know when and if operations will be resumed. And the question is whether we'll be able to continue to seize this opportunity in spite of the new challenges, since, well, it requires, as I said, incentives and interests from funders and providers and also the government.
Good, useful. And just from listening to what you're saying, Iana, the openness to new forms of partnership, novel partnerships between the public and the private sector, particularly given the idea that new private actors may be coming in, that sounds like it resonates. Are there other elements of the secret sauce of innovative finance? Are other elements which resonated with you when you see the challenges you face?
Yeah, I think the need of using data and measuring results and using results and evidence to make decisions, for us as MUVA, it resonates a lot because we work and we function as a think tank, and we use evidence-based decision-making processes to develop our project. So we think that this is a very good way to function as a program, as an institution, and having these secret sauce and innovative financing mechanisms really resonates to our work in MUVA.
Good, useful, thank you. By the way, feel free to disagree with me and don't have to. You're all welcome to say either I've got the secret sauce wrong or that you have your own version. That's absolutely fine as well. Chippo, at Harambee, you've actually had some direct experience now with innovative finance, a particular form, which you can probably tell us about. So again, from your perspective, what resonated from what I was talking about, and what made you think that adopting something new might help as you were at that sort of setup stage?
Sure, definitely. I think before I jump onto that, I just want to say, Iana, you raised such an interesting point in terms of like the linguistic barriers that Mozambique faces, because I think that is one of the major issues that we have across the continent in terms of communication. It's just that if you don't speak the same language, the news just doesn't go across, the deals don't go across. And that's something that I really hadn't properly taken into account in trying to understand Mozambique. So thank you for that. I think so, Rob, your secret sauce actually resonated with us quite a bit. So at Harambee, we were involved with Bonds for Jobs. And it was a social impact bond trying to innovate in the way that we do skilling in the South African context. So at the moment, the South African government spends about, I think, let me get this number right, it's like 14 billion Rand is spent every year on skilling and education, but for young people, but with very few results. So even though there's so much money going in terms of the input, the way that it's spent has been consistently incredibly ineffective. And so for us, we looked at this opportunity in Bonds for Jobs to address that on two levels, to see, number one, could we influence the way in which money is spent at the government level, and the way in which the government thinks about spending? Because in terms of our budgetary process, you're penalized for not spending all of your money. So it's important to make sure that you finish your budget, because if you don't, your money will get cut. And the way that we've assessed that whether you can finish your budget is if you spend a lot of money at the beginning on the inputs with very little connection to what happens at the end in terms of the outputs. And so that was the one element, is that like, could we show and provide an alternative model to assess whether funding was spent effectively for government programs? And then on the other side is that, could we also show that there are new and innovative ways to do skilling? I was talking to a colleague of mine who was working very closely on this project, and she said in one of the colleges that they went to try and understand different methods that people were skilled by, they still had a component where they were teaching students about floppy disks and how to use floppy disks, because the curriculum was designed at such a point when that was relevant, but they were afraid of changing that curriculum because they're like, if we deviate too far from what's been set by government standards, we won't get accreditation and we won't be able to run this program. So we'd rather have to teach students about floppy disks than go through the administrative hurdles of trying to change that. So from our end, we're like, okay, can we start to do some of that work to change that? Can we say that actually, you know, in global business services and installation, repair and maintenance, and in digital technologies, you don't necessarily need a 3-year degree. You can have a short and effective skilling program for about 6 weeks, and that can equip you with the skills that you need to be able to do to get the job done. And so for us, those were kind of like the two big areas where we're like, okay, a social investment bond sounds like it might be the right idea, and it sounds like it might be the right tool to help us to leverage on those points.
That is quite a scary example, Chipper, of floppy disks. But from what you're saying, I think resonates from what we see as social finance. So the rigidity of the rules around how money is spent can then feed through to rigidity of the programs themselves, which undermines their effectiveness. So that sounds very familiar, sadly. So Graham, Rebecca, I'll leave it to you to work out who's best to answer the different questions. But same question really around sort of what, I mean, you are doing some work, I think, with an impact bond. I mean, what got you moving down this road? Actually, also to add a sort of sub-question, this question about language. Now, obviously, we're not talking metaphorically about language, the different types of vocabulary that people use in your sector versus funders versus government. Was that also an element of why you need to do things differently? Because people were essentially talking past each other. That's a kind of supplementary question for you.
Yeah, no problem. We're going to take it in turns on the questions. Just your sub question. I didn't fully understand it. Are you talking about the various jargon that's introduced by different things?
Yeah, and I was reflecting on what Chipo and Iana said about language. In this case, Iana was talking about Portuguese and English in the Mozambican context. It made me think also that language can also be sort of metaphorically around jargon, people using different vocabulary or having different contexts, and that can be part of the problem in setting up a program to tackle something.
It can do, because everyone in any sector has their own jargon and abbreviations and everything. And within a setup like ours, where you have different stakeholders, some of the stakeholders might be already used to talking to each other in that language as well. And it's almost always 3-letter abbreviations in this country. So, for example, we're delivering IPS under an SIB in association with the LCF. So you can see how very quickly it gets to that point. But the only way around it really is for people to be honest when they don't understand something, and for you as the person talking to try and define it as much as possible. I wouldn't say it's a barrier. We're kind of used, I think, in the UK certainly, to seeing other people's jargon the whole time and just Googling it essentially and finding out what's going on. But there is certainly an element of that. In terms of of our social impact bond, I'm just going to talk briefly about that. So I'm just quickly sharing what a social impact bond is and how they're used in the UK, and then how ours actually differs from that a bit and why we think it works. So your standard social impact bond in the UK will be a collaboration of investors, government commissioners, and service providers. So the government commissioner will pay an investor based on the results generated, and the investor pays the service provider. This is particularly important with risk sharing. But the problem is you can see this group in the middle here, the contractors, can become quite convoluted, the way the money's changing hands, etc. And really, the only relationship that matters and that has to be done correctly and simply is the one between the service providers and the program participants. That's the most important thing here. And there is a risk with some innovative finance, I think, that you spend too much time trying to work out how a board of stakeholders work and not enough time focused on delivery. However, where ours differs, this is what our one looks like. So IPS is our contract. That's called individual placement and support. You can already see a bit of the jargon on here, can't you? It's a program for people with drug and alcohol, either current conditions or recent past history with that's preventing them from getting work. It's a straightforward get into work program. So job search, placement, not volunteer placements, education or anything like that. Now, the way it works here is there are a number of stakeholders that are actually funding this. So Ealing Council, Ealing is an area of London, is representing all these different investors here. So Big Issue Investor doing a social impact bond, the Life Chances Fund, where Ealing were able to get a grant from, and also the local authorities who are involved in the delivery area, which covers pretty much all the west of London. Everyone chipped in some money here. So the primary reason for innovative finance in this case was to get enough money together in the first place in order that a proper program could be delivered to people with drug and alcohol issues in the west of London. Consequently, the Commissioner, Ealing Council, working on behalf of the rest of West London, they play a very proactive role in tying together the different stakeholders and the interests that they have here. So Big Issue Invest, Life Chances Fund, and the other local authorities they represent, to create a very simple and straightforward funding and outcomes relationship that primarily exists between us and as the operational provider of IPS and them as the commissioner of it. Now, we regularly meet on full panels with all the others, but having the day-to-day single relationship means that anything going on up here with these with these stakeholders, a lot of the minutiae we're left out of, so that we can focus on delivery. And that, I think, is something that I would add to the secret sauce. That's that the innovative finance itself doesn't overcomplicate the day-to-day running of the service. And that's why our one, I think, really works. To add a brief bit more, the reason why we wanted to take part in it is it was an opportunity to give much more focused employability support to the people that we help. And the way it was put together with the different finances meant that it was viable and it could reach a large area, and that wouldn't have happened without innovative finance. In terms of the need, there are 15,000 people in treatment across this West London patch, and over 50% of children in care in the area are there because of parental mental health and drug issues. So it's a strong intergenerational issue in West London. And as we're quite an advanced economy in terms of labour market, they can be quite invisible as well. So it was an opportunity for us to reach out to around about over 1,000 people who were there wanting to work and not being helped to do so, to create employment opportunities for them. So as I said, our commissioner led the project. They developed an outline and they procured different people at different points, including us as the provider, including Big Issue Investors as the social funder. And we ended up with a total of 19 stakeholders from varying sectors. Now, that was something, when we went into it, we were worried could have been an absolute nightmare, but it's been anything but that. And that's because of the pivotal role that commissioner has played. And I think the other thing that I would touch on from your presentation, Rob, that was one of the critical ones to us, is the way in which this particular project is constructed financially. We are not taking the full financial risk. There was a combination of grants and block payments and payment by results. And we were also asked to self-assess the financial risk that we could take. And we made sure that we didn't apply it to all the money that was coming into the project. So it felt very fair in that regard. There was the eyes were open in terms of there is a payment by results element here. But we also felt that we had some certain protection with guaranteed funding as well, because the problem with payment by results is if you get penalised for not delivering, then you have less money to deliver with and improve, and it's a bit of a vicious circle, that one. And the other thing that should be said about payment by results in this country is I've never ever heard of a payment by results scheme where people get rewarded for overperformance. So that's the program in a nutshell. So what attracted it to us is that the innovative finance allowed it to be far more than it possibly could, and the way it's been managed, largely between ourselves and the commissioner, has meant that it's been a very straightforward provider-commissioner relationship, a lot of trust there, a lot of shared objectives. And so far, it's been working well.
Thank you, Graham. That point around how sharp are the incentives and are you incentivized to overperform feels like a valid one. And yeah, that's useful. Thank you for expanding the kind of scope of what we're looking at. It's very, very useful. Let's jump to South Africa. Chippo, essentially the same question for you, really, around what the bonds for jobs thing that Harambee was involved in. Like, what got you there?
So I mean, I think what got us there was really just understanding the complexity of the space, the complexity of the skill space in the South African job market, and the way in which like funds were poorly administered in terms of like that 14 billion in spending was just not going the way that it was. I think that once we got there though, what was quite complicated was this holding two parts. And I think, Graham, you articulated it so clearly, like if you are being paid by results, then you are completely penalized if you don't quite get it right. And so in our project, we were trying to do both. Number one, we're the first impact bond in the South African context. So we're trying to prove that it was a valid financial model and that it would make sense for both investors and for the government, and that like money could flow effectively through this kind of system. And then we were also trying to innovate in terms of like the programs that we were creating and creating sort of like new skilling opportunities. And so that level of complexity, where we were also at the same time the intermediary, because I think, like you mentioned, that intermediary, having the Ealing council be that person in between you and all of the 19 stakeholders, meant that you could function well. In the Harambee case, we also had to have that intermediary, and we had like a separate education unit that was developed to kind of administer like the technical skills training, but us as the accelerator were the intermediary as well, along with another body. And so the level of complexity that we were dealing with was something I think that we were a little bit, surprised by is not the right word, but it was something that was definitely confronting in terms of the process. And then because we were trying to balance that, like this is a viable financial option, it was also a little bit more difficult to take the kind of risks in terms of also proving that these are exciting and innovative like new skilling tools for young people. So I think that like it becomes a much more straightforward process when there's one that you're optimizing for, either to prove that the model works financially or to prove that the models that you're working with are innovative and new tools. When you're trying to prove both, the level of complexity that's in the space can make what's already a complex instrument even more difficult to work through.
That's a nice warning, Chipper, around avoiding over-engineering and too much complexity. And as Graham said, a program doesn't have to be 100% innovatively financed, and you can have an innovative bit of a program sitting alongside more sort of simple or traditional funding. But then, perhaps just following on from that, if we've been talking a bit about the kind of the why of innovative finance, then for you at Harambee, when it got to the sort of the how, how it went in practice when you started implementing, with that potential for complexity, did things go as expected? Was there sort of some slightly scary or unknown parts of trying to work in a different way? And what felt different? What felt good and bad about this new way of working?
I mean, so I think like what felt good was being able to bring the people alongside, and so to be able to get different funders with different kinds of rate cards all towards like a single goal. I think that was really good. What was surprising, I think, was the measurement. So the amount of measurement that was required. So when you're yeah, so the colleague who I was speaking to, who was like directly involved in this particular part, mentioned that like we were incredibly successful in being able to meet our goals for the first year, and we were able to meet our targets. And so that was something that worked and which we were quite excited about in terms of, you know, being able to deliver on these high quality and like high skilled interventions in a much shorter period of time. So that was something that we were really excited with. But in that year, we had 600 outcomes by which to like that needed to be verified and to be assessed as having been completed. And in that process, they had to look at between 4,000 to 5,000 data points to assess the outcomes for it. So there was also this continual and this immediate sort of like up curve around what skills you have to be able to internally measure, and also is your intermediary equipped as well to measure. So it's like in that context where we were doing something that was quite a pioneer in the field across, that meant that there was so much learning as we were going. And I think in as much as like there was an awareness of that, I don't think like anybody can really budget for looking at like 4,000 to 5,000 data points in order to like test an outcome effectively.
That makes me think let's get back to this question of data and measurement in a second. I want to go back to that one. It feels important. Rebecca or Graham, perhaps just first, the sort of same question to you. And I'm leaving Iana to one side for a second because MUVA's exploration of innovative finance is at a slightly earlier stage, whereas at WDP, as you've shown us, you're in the thick of this. So, I mean, Graham, you're already starting to flag some of the complexity of 19 different partners and how that might go wrong. Yeah, so going from the sort of theory of how you thought things should work to the practice of your impact bond getting implemented, were there things that went wrong? How did you kind of correct course? Was it possible to change things around as the secret sauce suggests that you can adapt and iterate? What was the sense of implementation on the ground?
Yeah, so I'm going to take this one. So in terms of sort of the implementation, I think sort of as Graham has touched on, with having so many people around it, there was the initial sort of anxiety of actually how do we manage so many people's expectations. And I think as you go in, you go quite blind, and you come from a place where a bit of caution actually on all parties really, because you don't actually know how exactly it will work. So there's a lot of assumptions as soon as you start discussing how the work's going to be and how the work operationally looks like as well. So for us, when we first started to implement, we had a phase where we were negotiating on the contract and actually the deliverables. And I think that stage was really important, and it's where everyone's voices were really heard. And there were times where we had to make compromise, and we had to go backwards and forwards quite a bit on particular things. For example, the level of involvement that we wanted people to have around recruitment, or the level of scrutiny we needed, or who actually was going to be responsible for taking ownership of a particular part of the project, and who should it be the managing agent, should it be the service provider? So there were some assumptions that were made, there was negotiations that went on. But I would say that early on, because of the way that it was set out, it was quite clear there was only 3 of us in the room, and that made a really big difference. So there was ourselves as the service provider, there was the managing agent who we had the relationship, and then there was the commissioner that Graham has mentioned. And I think just having those 3, it was very clear that although there was those 19 above us, we never really needed to worry too much about that or interact with that too much. And really, I think for us, when we implemented the project, the big focus, because it was a payment by results contract as well, is that we need to, from the outset, have a very performance-driven focus. So that means who we recruit needs to be very salesy and performance-driven. We need to have really clear outputs, really clear deliverables. We need to be really clear with who we actually take on. This is how this contract, and that whole voice of sort of performance has carried on from the start really to the end of, as we're carrying on with the contract. Performance is our key thing. And I think that's actually really helped the project, because it's just meant that we're actually on track with what we're trying to deliver, and that we actually have a number in our heads and we know what we're trying to aim for. And I think the strengths of this sort of model has been definitely the commissioner managing the stakeholder expectations. And, you know, if the negotiations going on, it would just be one person that we are actually liaising with. I think that made a really big difference. I think the financial risk was also lessened with having the SIB model, as Graham has said, because we had some input in that decision, and we've got a grant and outcome-based payments. Other things is like the outcomes and deliverables. I suppose like we've always needed flexibility to be able to deliver it so some of it was the learning as we've gone along, but I think as we've developed a good relationship with the key people, it's allowed us to have that flexibility to say that actually this is working well, but next quarter we're going to try this, this and this, which is going to make a difference to how we're doing things, because sometimes you don't exactly know how things are going to pan out. So you've got to kind of have that. So I think we have had some of that as well. And I think like, you know, openness and transparency have been really good strengths to this sort of model, and joint up problem solving as well. So when we've had COVID here, or when we've had something particular, it's not just been the service provider in this sort of model. We've had all three of us sit around the table and try and work through things, and just trying to make it work, because there's a financial investment from a lot of people. So for example, we want to integrate with a service and we need space. So that's been really positive because people have got an investment in this, so they want to make it work. So they want to give you some space, or they want to make the integration work because there is an investment in it as well, and they want the project to work. So I think those are the good things that have come out of it. I think on your question on things that not are bad, but you know, things that are maybe weaker on this sort of model, I mean, the tariffs are weighted differently for us. So the PBR, you know, we might get a different payment for a person entering full-time work to a person entering part-time work. But actually in our sort of sector, part-time work is just as valuable as full-time work. So we're looking at that, and we're thinking about our workers like, oh, you know, we do need to get full-time outcomes, but actually part-time outcomes could be the outcome that works holistically for someone with drugs and alcohol that can attend treatment, that has got a family, etc., etc. There's not always a cohesive way of thinking, I'd say, with this sort of model, because a lot of the people coming in on it have different inputs. So for example, if you've got someone like the health, from the health side, like the NHS, or you know, the clinical side that wants to contribute, they're very focused on seeing what their health outcomes are. But then you've got someone like the job centre who want people to come off the benefit and have the sustainment. So there's that sort of difference. It's not always similar in the way that even the providers or who's investing are thinking on where the importance is for things like that. I suppose the other things is difficulties to apply the outcomes and tariffs equally everywhere due to contributing factors. So, you know, we may want to have all the will to try and make sure everywhere is doing the same thing, but it's not as easy on the ground operationally when you're trying to run the project. And it's difficult because you don't get that recognition in a payment by result model, because it just gets applied. So you have to kind of take that into consideration as a provider and try and marry it up with how you're delivering in different places. So those would be some of the things, really.
Thank you for being so sort of frank and nuanced, Rebecca, both on the kind of the good and the bad. And what I'm taking from what you're saying is that if you are going to pay someone for results delivered, then you've got to be really careful to define what those results are, and to make sure that they're appropriate, not just for the organisation, but for the participants in the programme. So yeah, that it makes sense to be really careful at the early stages. Good. We're going to have just one more question for everybody, and I'm going to start with Iana because she's been left a little bit behind by the discussion on impact bonds that are happening so far, and then we'll have hopefully about 20 minutes to have some Q&A. Iana, I wanted to ask you about essentially this data and measurement question. In the Mozambique context, you're frequently working in informal employment markets, where I'm assuming that getting data and measuring what's happening in your program is particularly hard. Maybe you could tell us a bit about that sort of data challenge.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. I think this is a very important question for people working in countries that have a big informal market. And I think it adds another layer of complexity to what Chipo was saying regarding the amount of data points and data collection needed to support the metrics of a development impact bond or innovative financing mechanism. And actually, we don't know yet the answer to measuring social impact bonds contracts, for instance, for informal employment, but by working in a country as Mozambique, it's impossible not to look deeply into this problem. And for the sake of illustrating the difficulty, I'll use an example of some of our projects and how we measure informal income. So in MUVA, we work where, of course, the majority of the women participating in the labor market are, so in the informal economy. And for all our projects, because we are a learning institution and we function as a think tank, we create a specific monitoring and evaluation system to each of our projects. So we have this one called MUVA Plus, where our goal is to increase the profits of female traders in informal street markets so they could benefit themselves, of course, their families, and the surrounding informal employment economy, such as the carriers, the storage keepers, the suppliers, and so on. And of course, to know for sure if we succeeded, we had to invent a monitoring and evaluation system that captured in a daily basis the cost and the revenue of our participants. And who are our participants? They are digitally excluded, so no data collection through SMS, for instance. At baseline, they didn't have any kind of bookkeeping system. And for us, the most challenging one probably is that they are quite cautious about sharing their business financial data to data collectors that they never saw in their lives, and that are asking very intrusive questions. So to be able to collect reliable data, we had to address the technical issue, the trust issue, and more, sorry, something is happening. Wait, sorry.
We can hear you and see you fine. But Iana, you're now on mute.
Sorry, something happened with my screen.
We can see and hear you fine.
Okay, I forgot where I was, but well. So to be able to collect reliable data, we had to address, of course, the technical issue of bookkeeping and etc., the trust issue, and more exogenous factors such as seasonality, for instance. So we needed to do a control group to take out the seasonality factor. But reversing back to our discussion about innovative financing measurement, I think there's a question about measuring formal income and employment that needs to be addressed if we want to use innovative financing in larger scale in low and medium income countries. And we explored this a bit during our work, Rob, together, but definitely further research is needed, because in a country where formal employment contracts are very scarce and there are no unified employment database, how do we measure an impact bond for increasing the access of women to wage employment? Will we ignore the biggest avenue for employment in the country because it's informal? And I think, I mean, believe me, I know there are no simple answers to these questions, but we need to speak about them, and if we want to expand innovative financing mechanisms. And I think an important point to be taken in consideration is whether the amount of resources needed to measure the informal economy is prohibitive to an impact bond contract, and how we can de-risk this.
Good, thank you, Iana. What I think I'm going to do, if that's okay, is take that last question on data and measurement and you know, how do you tackle that challenge? I'll take that to Chipo in the South African example. And then, if that's okay, Graham, Rebecca, I think we'll then open things up to questions, and you may get the same question coming back for the UK context. So Chipo, is that okay? So obviously in the South Africa context, I mean, you'll have a dual challenge. You have the informal markets that, or informal informal markets that Iana's mentioned, but also you have a large formal sector as well. Maybe this adds extra challenge when it comes to data and measurement.
Completely. I mean, so I think, so specifically like in the Bonds for Job context, we were looking at formal sector jobs only. So we're looking at jobs in the digital space, in the installation, repair and maintenance space, which is artisanal work such as like plumbing and mechanics. And we were also looking at it in the global business services space, which is kind of more work that is like office work that is generally outsourced to different countries. And so that's sort of where global business services kind of fits in. And so even though our context was incredibly formal, the measurement still provided a significant challenge. Okay, on my side, you guys are still, can you guys still hear me?
Yeah, all fine.
Okay, cool, that's perfect. But maybe I'll just switch off my camera so I can keep the signal strong. And so I think, so in this particular context, even though it was formal, there was still a lot of complexity in figuring out how to measure this in a way that was a credible outcome, to say not just, okay, we've now provided these 600 people with jobs, but like, what is the quality of the jobs and the quality of the training that they found that makes this a legitimate outcome? So part of that was like one of the outcomes was improving the literacy. And so what are effective and efficient ways to test for improved literacy amongst adult candidates was one of the challenges that we faced. And so I think we found a way to do that within the program, but we still didn't necessarily find a way to like measure that easily, effectively, and quickly in ways that are outside of the program. And so I think when it comes to these measurement issues, it's like, are we measuring to kind of tick a box, or are we measuring to better understand how the impact works? And I think that when you are in a sort of results-driven place, there can be a temptation to create measurement factors that allow you to tick a box. But I think like the more pressing challenge is like, how do you integrate more, I guess, more intuitive measurement mechanisms that allow you to actually calculate meaningful value over time across the system? Because ideally, I guess the whole point of these bonds is to create more value for people in terms of like the impact that like money, the impact that money can have in the system. And so I think with measurement, like that's where the challenge is like, how do you move outside of like measuring to meet demand to measuring so that you can actually truly assess the value?
I can't agree more, Chipper. The idea of measuring for measurement's sake seems like seems obtuse. And hopefully in your program you are measuring because that helps you improve the program, which I guess is the idea. Brilliant. We've got about 20 minutes left, and I think let's throw it open to the audience. We've been talking a lot. We've covered a lot of stuff. And what I'm going to suggest is slightly risky. We're going to people either put things in the chat, and I think Lazan, you're going to help me try and work out how we can batch those together. So if you want to stick some things in the chat now, that's a perfect time. And then also, if you just want to stick your hand up with the raise hand function, and we'll try and then pick kind of group 2 or 3 together. So either or, and let's see how this works. Assuming everyone hasn't dropped off already. Now, Lazan, help me. I am looking at the participant list. I'm looking for some hands. Am I missing anything so far?
Not currently.
Okay, that's fine. We have some backup questions. If people are being shy or bored, we have some backup questions we can ask, so that's fine. Give it another minute or so.
Yeah, perhaps we can continue with the questions that you've prepared, Rob, and in the meantime, if anyone has questions, we'll feed that in.
Yeah, good idea. So from now on, if you've got, stick your hand up or please start to add to the chat. Good, and then something else I did want to follow on, thing which, Rebecca, I think you mentioned, I think it was you that mentioned it very briefly in passing, which was in a way the big elephant in the room, and while we're all spending our time on webinars. So the impact of of COVID-19. So I guess, again, this is really a question for Harambee and WDP as organizations that are sort of midway through implementing programs that have some element of innovative finance in them. So the question is, over the last 16 months, how has your program adapted? Has it been able to adapt well? And how difficult were the discussions with the funders for doing something which was really kind of quite a hard situation to manage when you had a program plan? I kind of know the answer a bit from Chippo. So let's start with Graham or Rebecca first to hear from the UK context.
Yeah, so in terms of the COVID situation, so with everyone else, we were in the same situation that no one knew this would hit or how this would affect us. So I think it was a very sort of unsettling time for not just the people who were delivering, but also actually the participants. A lot of the anxiety around it had also changed in terms of the climate, but also the labour market, but how people's motivation was, and actually things that were going on for them with that particular period as well. And we quickly realised that actually we're going to need to make a change here, because where we were projecting our numbers, we were not going to be meeting, or we didn't know, actually, is the truth. We just didn't know actually how it would go or where we'd be with it. So part of our thinking around this was to sort of have an honest and frank conversation with the people involved, to say that we don't know, we are in a position that we're having difficulties. So we did sit around the table with the commissioner and the managing agent to say that this is where we're at, this is some of the initial feedback we're getting from staff, but also participants. We do feel that a sensible approach is to take a hold on PBR, so the payment by results element, and we had negotiated a grant payment only, which was increased for a period of 6 months for an interim. And then the intention was that we would wait and see how those 6 months went. And I think it was really good that was negotiated, because it gave us a bit of breathing space to work it out, because especially for the first few months, everyone was working it out together. As an organisation, we were having an approach that we were trying to roll out. You know, people were affected in so many different ways that it was taking time and new ways of working. What has come out of it that's been really good is we've now got a blended approach to our offer, which we didn't have before. So now we've got a digital offer. So, you know, people are now receiving support on an online platform, but it does also present other issues of people not having necessarily the tools they need to be able to access it. And so it's now that we're coming out of it a bit, there's other things that have come out. But I think on the plus, we've definitely taken some of those things with us. We've gone back to an outcome-based model, which is working well. And actually the effect, we did see it, but it wasn't to the extent we maybe anticipated. So for example, in our first year of delivery, where we also had mobilisation, we achieved over 100 jobs. In the COVID for the year, we actually achieved 86 jobs. So it didn't affect us as much as we maybe thought it was going to. And there were still jobs, and there were still people looking for jobs as well. So COVID was an interesting one. There's still learning coming for us. But I think with the people involved, we were able to negotiate well, and it suited all parties just for a shorter period.
Okay, that's useful. So there's a significant sort of flex in how you've been delivering this with, as you said, results-based payment being on hold for a while, but now back into that. Okay. Chippo, the situation with Harambee has been a bit more difficult with COVID, right? Kind of fundamentally because of the nature of the intervention. Is that right?
Yeah, completely. I mean, I think also partially because of the nature of lockdown in South Africa. So when we had our first lockdown at the beginning of the sort of COVID period, that was pretty much 2 months where nobody really did anything. We had quite strict lockdown measures. So people were basically in their houses all day and weren't able to leave, even I think like for the first month or so, even for a walk, like you didn't have a walk, and then we like started to let people out for a walk. And that was the period where we found ourselves, where we recently, at the beginning of the year, had renegotiated contracts, had brought in new suppliers, had brought in new funders, and had been poised to start sort of on the year 2 version. And now we're suddenly faced with this crisis where we're like, okay, what do we do? And so on our end, we decided that because ours was very much of a sort of outcomes-based measurement, and because the risk profile had fundamentally changed, it didn't really make sense to continue because we didn't know what risk we were walking into and what kind of context in which people would begin hiring again. And it was really interesting because like some of our funders actually, and Rebecca, I think your story kind of puts to that in terms of like where funders were coming from. Some of our funders actually pushed back on that and were like, we would like to continue because we have the risk appetite to take that, like, you know, it's okay for this not to go through. But ultimately, I think with the overall risk profile of the deal and the overall way money was structured on the different rates cards, it made sense for us to end the program there, having achieved success in the first year and having sort of proved the key points that we wanted to, that number one, this kind of financing model was possible. And that number two, short-term skilling could be used effectively to place people in jobs. And so because we had been able to prove the things we were looking to prove, we said, at this point, it makes sense given the changing nature of things.
Good, thank you. Yes, that makes sense. And I can see these are some quite tough decisions to make in the current situation. We had some good questions coming through on the chat, and we've got about just under 10 minutes left. Let me just take them in order, and I'm not quite sure who to throw them out first, but I apologize for mispronunciation. Sibongile, as I understand the question, essentially you're saying, is it important that the implementers of a program are all delivering the same program along a strict model in order to sort of quality assure that program, and so that you have the integrity of the measured outcomes, presumably as opposed to flexibility and diversity in what's being delivered, if I understand the question correctly. But I think everyone else can see the question as well. So actually, Chippo, given that, given what you've just said, maybe that's one which you could have a first go at. Is it clear enough, the question for you?
I think so. If my understanding is that basically just like how does everybody need to be doing the same things in order for it to be effectively measured in the outcomes?
Yeah, I think my understanding is sort of how and sort of strictly and slightly rigidly done, as opposed to having room for switching things around, as I understand the question.
Sorry, it just, my internet cut out as you said that. Sorry, could you repeat that again?
Yeah, I was saying, as I understand the question, the sort of a strict model of implementation, as opposed to, I assume, changing the program around, and whether, if you're changing the program around halfway through, whether that somehow undermines the integrity of the outcomes and how you measure them.
I mean, I think so. I think it actually depends a lot on how the outcomes are based. So I guess like in our context, because we were looking at 3 completely different sectors with completely different sort of like models of training and models of skilling, like there wasn't any way that somebody who's going into a digital program would have the same sets of skills as somebody who's going into an installation, repair, and maintenance program. And so I think it's a question of when the outcomes are selected, what is it that the outcomes are trying to assess for? And if the outcomes are trying to assess for like a sort of like fundamental placement, like if the outcomes are trying to like assess for something like, can shorter skills terms get you into good quality jobs, then there is a little bit more flexibility in the way in which the programs are implemented and the opportunities that you have to change the programs in order to like reach that outcome. But if the outcomes I think are a little bit more narrowly defined, then I think it can get a little bit tricky in terms of quality. But I would love to hear other people's opinions on this.
Good. Anyone else on the panel who wants to chip in on that one?
Yeah, I can come in on that one. On the surface of it, the program that we were delivering, IPS, is quite restrictive in a way. It has certain rules about how you have to go about getting the referrals from people, what they have to commit to sign up to the program, what you can and can't do, and also time-bound working as well. Now, in one way, that sounds very restrictive, but in another way, it's great for ensuring the integrity of the program because you are really clear right from when you sign up what the outcomes are, And IPS itself also has something called a fidelity scale that IPS programs can be rated against, which says how well you're adhering to the delivery principles. And that's actually quite important, so that also the stakeholders involved know what they're supposed to be getting and know that they're getting it. But to talk about innovating within that, and hopefully this answers another of the Q&As I've seen from Holly Asquith, we've still managed to innovate and iterate within the funding environments, because within the actual program itself, there are so many different ways to help someone into work, so many different innovative things you can do. And what we've tried to do is, as an organization, adhere to the stricter requirements, but then give our staff the room to innovate and to bring their own skills into how they work with their clients, rather than just follow this, that, and the other. And consequently, we've had some areas of quite innovative practice within that, and we've designed different group programs around COVID, for example. So I'd say it's a big advantage overall, but that the organisation then has to work out how to let its staff innovate from within that.
Thanks, Graham. Can I just ask myself, that is what you're saying, that within the individual placement support approach that you adopt, there are certain protocols of how to do it. So you can't just completely throw the rule book up in the air, but within those protocols, there's plenty of choices to make and decisions of how to proceed on the ground. And is the point then that this kind of approach, it's not as if IPS is completely unproven and totally innovative, never tried before. I mean, it has evidence on how it works in terms of the likelihood of delivering results. And so in a way, it's not completely risky as a program to back with innovative finance. It's sort of kind of risky enough, as in there's a chance it won't deliver the results, but there's enough evidence elsewhere that it will, and you're kind of operating in that middle ground. And you have, hence within that middle ground, some space to change and innovate. Is that fair?
Yeah, I'd say that's fair. The big risk here was that IPS has been used far more often for mental health, with mental health conditions, rather than substance misuse issues. So that was probably the larger risk going into it. But one of the biggest risks that you get in somewhere like the UK is there are actually a lot of different people funding employment programs in an area. So one of the risks that you take is to make sure that the area actually isn't saturated with programs and that there's enough referrals to go into the program. We've been fortunate in that we've discovered that we have had enough.
Good. Right. So, yeah, I'm feeling bad that some of these questions are focused on the doing, which you're not yet at, and hopefully will be soon. What I can suggest is, and with apologies for not covering all the questions in the chat and the Q&A, is that we start to wrap up. And what I really want to do is to give everyone a chance for kind of final words. And in a way, what I'd love everyone to give is a kind of final sort of 30-second pitch of all the things we've talked about today, and the kind of theory of innovative finance and the practicalities of your programs on the ground. What's the one message that you would like people listening in to remember when they go to bed tonight? What's the one message to take away? And I'm going to totally randomly choose an order. Chippo, why don't you start us off?
Sure. I think so. The message that I think I'd like to leave people with is like that it's possible. It's possible to use innovative finance models to address complex problems. So even if like the measurement is tricky, even if it's like a multifaceted problem that brings together so many different things, and the outcomes are based on like, the rand-dollar exchange rate and so many other different parts of things coming together, it's still possible to use innovative finance to shape more successful outcomes for everyone, and that they really should be a move towards outcomes-based financing in terms of the way that we think about government spending, because that's one of the ways that we can guarantee that public money is used effectively. So that's what I'd like to leave people with.
Good. Here to that from my side. I don't want to pretend that I fed you that response. Rebecca, perhaps you'd like to give us from WDP side a final 30-second pitch.
Yeah, I think just it's actually to echo very much what Chippo said. I think innovative finance can work well, and I think even when, I suppose the takeaway is, even when you have a model such as ours, which appears quite complex with lots of people involved with it, actually on the ground it could be fairly straightforward if the mechanisms behind the scenes are actually addressed well enough. And actually it can mean that the participants' outcomes are at the forefront for your project. So operationally that can work very well.
Good, all right. That's a good pithy message. And Iana, we started with MUVA Mozambique, and we'll end with you as the final word.
I'll be picky on this one and add a little bit of piri-piri, as we say in Mozambique. I think the message here for me as well, and from our work together, which was really helpful and very good, is that if we copycat models from the north to the south and from developed countries to low-income countries, we probably won't be able to achieve the results expected, and we'll learn further down the line that a lot of adaptation will be needed. So working from scratch with on-the-ground players and local partners is important, very important. And from MUVA side, we'll continue working towards that and investing in a more inclusive and gender equal economy in Mozambique.
Good, and then so my question to you then, Iana, is everything we've discussed, is it too much of a kind of invented somewhere else and sent to Mozambique, or is there something something here which you can find that's very kind of adaptable to this Mozambique situation? I'll ask as a final question.
Yeah, no, I think there is, but I think we need to address and try to find a way to understand how we'll measure and include informal employment, part-time employment, and all those sorts and variables of variants of employment in a very in an economy that are very few formal opportunities. So I think yes.
Good, brilliant. Thank you everyone, and thank you for those who've hung on. We'll either put in the chat now or send around afterwards the link to the report that we've done with MUVA. And I just want to say thank you for everyone for being so frank and nuanced. And this is not all just a kind of silver bullet. It's something which requires work and but in the right context can produce better results. Thank you everyone for joining. There's the link to the report, and we will write up something short and blog it soon. Is there anything else that I need to mention? Brilliant. Okay. Thank you, everybody. That's been really informative. Okay. Bye.
Thank you.